Hello everyone, my name is Mohammad Purhamayon. I hope you are all healthy and safe. In this video, we start talking about artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks is one of the most important topic in machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence, of course. It's a group of machine learning algorithms and systems and models that are developed based on the biological brain or biological neural system. We will see in this class that these algorithms are very powerful, especially in some cases that I'm going to talk about. They are the most advanced and accurate machine learning models for some specific applications that we are going to cover in this class. Artificial neural networks, or also known as ANNs, or simply called neural networks, is a family of machine learning systems and models and algorithms inspired by a biological brain or by humans' nervous system, particularly the brain. Neural network algorithms try to mimic the brain. In summary, neural networks are able to learn from data and generate models that get a number of inputs and map them to the desired outputs, exactly like our brain. So our brain does the same thing. It receives some signals from body sensors, for example, your eyes, your ears. And they send signals to our brain, so the brain gets some inputs from our body sensors and it generates some outputs, right? So for example, it sends commands to our muscles, for example. So if you feel something, if you see something, if your brain receives a signal from our eyes, from our skin, from our ears, it processes that, and based on that it makes a decision and generates some outputs. Sometimes we think to make a decision, but sometimes our brain makes a decision in a fraction of seconds. So when you touch something, a hot metal, for example, the skin sends signals to your brain, and in a fraction of seconds your brain commands your hand to move. So some inputs and some outputs. We want to do the same thing in artificial neural networks. We want to receive some inputs. Like every machine learning algorithm, these inputs will be features. So your algorithm, your artificial neural network will receive features as the input, and it generates some outputs, okay? So these outputs can be used for example, classification. It can be, for example, the label of something that you want to predict, or it can be used for decision making and so on. So we will talk about different approaches, different applications, and different models. Our brain can learn so many things, so many different things, and it can perform many things, many tasks. It can make so many amazing decisions and it can generate millions of output commands based on various types of input data. So our brain can process, for example, visual signals that it receives from eyes. It can process audio signals received from ears and many other things. Okay, so this is a system that can receive millions and millions of signals as input and process that and generates millions of outputs in a second. So the system is very sophisticated. It can process different type of signals. So to mimic the brain, this is an important question. Do we really need to write thousands of different algorithms to learn and perform all of those tasks? So our brain, it performs millions of different algorithms, okay, each one of them to do something, each one of them to process a type of signal. So if we want to make an artificial neural network to mimic the brain, in fact, do we really need to do the same, to write codes, for example, for thousands of different algorithms? Well, the answer is no. The scientists discovered that all different things are learned using one single general algorithm. Okay, and this is what we want to use in artificial neural network. So let me show you an example. And this is a test that scientists did in 90s on some animals, on some rats, to check the functionality of brain and see how it works. So in rats, well, we know that ears, they are connected to a special part of the brain using this nerve, and this part of the brain is responsible for processing audio signals. So this part of the brain is called auditory cortex, which is responsible for processing audio signal, and it's connected to ears. So what they did was that they disconnected this nerve that goes from ear to this part, the same part, auditory cortex, and instead they connected the nerve that comes from eyes to this part. So in fact, this part of the brain was the part that was responsible for processing audio signal, okay? So, but they disconnect this nerve and they provided visual signal to this part of the brain, okay? In some rats, this was an experiment. And in a few days, they noticed that, of course, those rats couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. But after a few days, after some time, they noticed that the rats started to make reaction to light, and they started to see. Okay, so this is very important, and this was an amazing experiment. So in fact, the part of the brain that was originally designed and learned to process only audio signal, which is called auditory cortex, it learned to see. It learned to process like video signals or visual signals. So the part of the brain that was responsible to hear learns to see, in fact. So this is a very important discovery. So it shows that the different parts of the brain can process different data. It just depends what type of data you provide to them. It means that maybe there is a general structure in the brain, and this general neural network can learn different things based on the data that we provide to them. So if we provide visual data, it learns to see. If we provide audio data, it learns to hear. So this is a very important discovery. And then they tried that with another in another experiment. They tried another part of the brain that was responsible for sense of touch by connecting that into the nerve that comes from eye. Again, that part of the brain started to see. It learns to see. Well, again, the brain is a big mystery. We know a little, very little, about the brain and its functionality, to be honest. But this experiment shows that different parts of the brain can learn different things. So it is based on data. It means that it is a kind of data driven. So whatever type of data we provide to it, it would learn to process that and it will learn from it. So it's a kind of machine learning. And it's a very, very advanced type of machine learning, which is called neural network. So if we want to mimic a brain, if we want to perform or develop a system like our brain that can do thousands or millions of different algorithms and tasks, we don't need to develop and write codes, for example, for millions of different algorithms. We need to build a system that can learn from data, and then after providing different types of data to this system, it will learn from it, it will learn how to process that, and it will perform the tasks that we want. So this is the main idea behind artificial neural network. Our brain can learn by wiring billions of neurons, so about 100 billion with a B, okay? About 100 billion neurons are located in our brain, and it made one of the most sophisticated network in the universe, okay? It is extremely complicated neural network. So just think about that. 100 billion nodes are connected to each other. Many of them are connected to each other. And usually in a, for example, a newborn baby, its brain is more complex because many of those neurons are almost most of them are connected to each other. The network is very, very complex. That is why a newborn baby or a baby can learn many, many different things at the same time. But because the network is so complex, the performance of the system is low. That's why the kids can learn many different things at the same time, but it takes more time for them to learn. So they are slow learners. So when they grow, for adults, for example, and the brain performs some kind of process. It's called synaptic pruning, that I'm going to talk about it later. It is similar to solving the problem of overfitting. So it makes the network simpler, so its performance is higher. So I'm going to talk about it later. So to mimic the brain, there are, of course, two different approaches. So the first approach, which is the approach that usually neurologists or neuroscientists try, is by extracting a blueprint of the whole brain, okay? Extracting a blueprint of the whole human brain and then trying to reconstruct and simulate it. Well, this is really difficult. It's a kind of like reverse engineering. And there are some projects, there are a lot of scientists all around the world. Most of them are neuroscientists or neurologists trying to do that. But approach two is the approach that data scientists and computer scientists try to do. By simulating a neuron, which is the brain simplest element, or the neural network simplest unit, okay? By just simulating one cell or one nervous cell, we call it neuron. By first simulating this, and then generating a complex artificial neural networks by connecting many of these neurons together, like our brain. So our brain includes about 100 billion neurons, okay? So, but first, if we can mimic one neuron, and then connect many and many and many of them together, we will probably can mimic a simple, very, very simple version of our brain. So, but for the first approach, they are very interesting videos if you would like to watch. So there are specifically two projects. I put the YouTube videos here you can watch. One of them is the Human Brain Project, a large 10 years scientific research project, and that they start to extract the brain structure and map. And also the Blue Brain Project, same thing, that is, it started in 2005. Again, in this project, the scientists try to extract a blueprint of the brain, to create a map of the brain, something like that. Both of them are some European projects, but many scientists all around the world are involved. But as I mentioned, they are mostly neuroscience. Okay, so most of the scientists that are working on this project are neurologists or neuroscientists. Computer science people uses usually the second approach, and the results have shown that this approach works very, very well. So all of those systems that we have developed so far in computers, in all of the neural networks that we use in computers, in, for example, cell phones, on internet, to process many, many different things that I'm going to talk about later. All of those machine learning algorithms, all of those advanced machine learning algorithms and techniques, deep learning, and so on, that we use it these days to process images, audio, video, for natural language processing, for example, they are all based on this approach too. So to do that, artificial neural networks are developed by simulating a neuron, okay, first of all, and then connecting a lot of them to create a network of neurons. So this is what a neuron looks like. It has, of course, some inputs, some input branches which are called dendrites, and some outputs. This is the output, axon terminals. So these are inputs. These are inputs, and a cell body. Okay. So what happens is that it receives some input signals and then process that here in the body and generate some outputs. Okay. And then thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of these neurons are connected to each other in our brain in this way. So the output of one neuron, it goes to as an input of other neurons. So now we want to build this neuron. We want to simulate it. We want to mimic this. So we need a model that looks like that. It receives some inputs, it processes that and generates some outputs. So this is the model that has been developed over time to simulate a neuron. Okay, so it has some inputs. These are the inputs. Okay, so we receive inputs here. X1, X2, and X3 are the inputs. So each one of these branches has some effect on the input signal. So we simulate that by some weights on these branches. So in fact, you multiply this input x3 to weight 3, x2 to weight 2, and x1 to weight 1. So these are some coefficients. You multiply each input signal to these weights and then add them up here. You just add them up, and then we should have a nonlinear function here, right here. So this, the behavior of the cell body, it looks like a nonlinear function. So we perform the same thing. So this is a nonlinear function that receives all of these signals, and eventually it generates an output. So this is a neural network unit, also called a node or artificial neuron, is the smallest element of a neural network that tries to mimic a brain neuron. Okay, so again, these are inputs, these are some weights, and integrate everything. And this is very important, a nonlinear function. So this model includes two main parts. The first part is a linear combination of the inputs. So this is the linear combination. Here you go. So it looks like multiplying each input by a weight and then add them up. Okay, so far this part is linear up to here. Up to here, we have a linear combination. In the second stage, the sum of product is passed into a nonlinear function. So f right here is a nonlinear function. It's called activation function. So remember this keyword, activation function, which generates the output of the neuron. In general, we may have many different inputs, many inputs. There is no limit on that. In addition to our inputs, that are in fact our features. If you want to use a neural network as a machine learning, these inputs will be features. And in addition to those features, we add a constant value here, which is called bias. Okay, to take care of the DC part of the equation. We usually show it with B, and the weight for that is usually called W0. And so this will be our function, or our output, okay? F, which is our nonlinear function, this guy, of all of the inputs multiplied by the weights plus the bias part. Okay, so this is the equation that you use to define the output of or to calculate the output of a neuron. As for activation function, as I mentioned, we usually prefer this to be nonlinear. Okay, so if you use linear, then it doesn't make that effect. It's like multiplication by something. That's why we usually use a nonlinear function, and there are several functions that we usually use in artificial neural networks. So a step function, of course, is the simplest one, and to use it, we usually use logistic sigmoid function. Talked about it before in logistic regression, you remember? So logistic sigmoid function is a kind of very similar to a step function. And so this is our function right here. As you remember, the sigmoid function has the value of 1 when the input gets large, and it has the value of 0 when the input gets very small. So as the input tends to a large positive value, the output will approach to 1. And the signal will be always in the range of 0 to 1. So this is one of the functions that can be used. The one important thing about sigmoid function is that it kind of describes the closeness to the threshold point right here by the curve slope. So what does that mean? So as z approaches to negative infinity or positive infinity, the slope is 0. Okay, so it means that, so the slope of this line, look at the slope of this tangent, it will be 0 if we make it too high or too small. But as we get closer to the threshold point, which is this point, the slope will be higher and higher. So it kind of represent the closeness, so the slope of the line, the slope of the curve, it represents the closeness to this point, to the threshold. So remember that. This is a cool thing to remember. And it also, the range is limited in the range of 0 to 1, the output. This is another function that is very popular, especially these days, for as the activation function. It's called rectified linear unit, or ReLU. Very popular, especially in deep learning, in deep neural network, that I'm going to talk about later. So the red one is rectifier, or ReLU. And the blue one is called soft plus, which is actually the smooth approximation of ReLU. The smooth approximation of ReLU. So these are two other activation functions that can be used. I'm going to talk about it later. ReLU is very popular in deep neural networks, and I'm going to tell you later in deep learning why. All right, so these are some sample functions. There are some other functions that we are going to talk about later. For example, softmax is another popular activation function. But anyway, this is our model for one single neuron, and this f is the activation function. We show it with an A that I just talked about. It can be sigmoid or ReLU or softmax, or one of those nonlinear functions. From now on, for the sake of simplicity, because we want to, this is just one neuron, okay? We want to connect many of them together. So for the sake of simplicity, we use the following figure, this picture, okay? To represent a unit, or a neuron, to represent one neuron. So when you see something like that, it means that this is a neuron, and it includes an activation function like this, and these are inputs and these are the weights multiplied to each input. Now, with this model, similar to human brain, an artificial neural network is formed by connecting multiple neurons, okay? The most common structure of connecting neurons into a network is by layers, okay? So to make it more structured, we used the layer by layer format. So as you see here, we have 3 inputs, okay? And we have 4 neurons, 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 artificial neuron. These are the input features, and they are connected to all neurons. So look, it goes to this one, it goes to this one, and it goes to this one. So all neurons receive the input signal and process that. So this will be our first layer, and this will be our second layer. Of course, this is a very, very simple network, including only 4 neurons. So just think about it. Our brain includes about 100 billion of these, okay? So now you can imagine how complex our brain is. And so the first layer is or layer 0 is usually called input layer. I mean this layer of inputs. Layer 1 and 2 and so on. Well, the last layer is called output layer. Of course, this is output layer. which in this case it is also layer 2 because the network only has 2 layers. It can have many layers, and everything in between is called hidden layer. Okay, so remember these keywords: input layer, hidden layers, and output layer. So this is called hidden layer because you can imagine, you can think of neural network as like a black box. Okay, so it can be a black box with many hidden layer inside the box, like our brain. Like our brain is like a black box. Some inputs goes to the brain from our body sensors like eyes and ears and so on, and some output comes, some signals that goes to our muscles, for example, to move. So you can imagine, you can think of our brain or a neural network as a black box. That's why these are called hidden layers. As you see here, this is called fully connected network, because in each layer everything is connected to every neuron. So every input signal goes to every neuron, for example, in the first layer, and every output of the first layer goes to the input of the next layer. So everything is connected. That's why it's called fully connected network. And everything in a network, this is very important to remember, everything in the network is defined by these weights. Okay, weight, there are different weights here, and sometimes you can make this connection, actually you can disconnect this wire but assigning a weight of 0 to that. Okay, so in our brain some of the neurons are disconnected. To simulate that in an artificial neural network, we can assign the weight of 0 to those wires, to those connections. So weight of 0 means disconnect. Okay, and everything in this neural network is defined by those weights. Okay, so each one of these paths, each one of these connections has a weight. Okay, and I will show you that in the process of training of a neural network, we have to find these weights. Okay, so these are the weights that we have to learn in the process of training of a neural network. Everything that we need to know are these weights. Okay, these weights will define what signals are connected to what neurons and how the network can process that signal in the forward propagation. So this is all we need to learn in the process of training. All right, so this is all about, well, it was a short introduction to neural network. In next video, I'm gonna talk more about first of all the notation of the network. Okay, what kind of notation we use to define different parts of that, and we will talk about more complex networks, and later we will talk about training, how we can train a neural network and how we can use it. Thank you.